Hello and welcome to this lecture. And in this lecture, we are actually going to go through the files which we have in our photo app, and we are going to learn about the significance of those particular files. So, even before we start learning about the files, we first need to understand what Django actually is and what is the main purpose of using Django for web development or for web application development. So, as I earlier mentioned, Django is actually a web development framework for Python. And what a framework is that a framework is something which does your job easier creating some kind of project. So Django, as I suggested, is a backend framework, is actually helpful for creating database models. It's actually helpful for retrieving data from the database, displaying it on your web page. It's actually going to handle some functions like URL routing. It's also going to give you guys the administrator's dashboard so you don't have to create it separately. So speaking simply, Django is actually a framework which helps you to develop the backend in a much more efficient way. So when you talk about a particular website, a website is actually composed of two parts, the front end and the back end. For front end, we actually have languages like the HTML, we have CSS for actually styling the elements, but in the back end where we have the database, we need to do a bunch of things with the database. That is, we have to create the database, we have to manage the database, we actually have to go ahead, add the data into the database, retrieve data from the database. So all these things which we do with the backend, Django actually makes it much more simpler, and it actually combines the front end with the back end, and that's how Django helps us in making web applications much more faster. So I can actually go into much more depth into this particular subject, but for now this much information is enough, and eventually as we move along in the course you will be able to understand Django in a much more better way. That is what Django is, why it is used, and how it actually works, and actually helps us to simplify the process of developing the backend. Okay, so now let's actually go ahead and talk about these files here. So this init.py file is nothing but the file which is used for initialization. It's actually empty at this point, but for now let's actually ignore this file. Let's move on to the next file, which is an interesting file which is called as admin.py. So what exactly is admin.py? So Django actually provides you a very interesting functionality of having an admin panel for your website. So what exactly is an admin panel? So, an admin is someone who actually manages the entire website. And while you create websites for your customers, for your clients, so let's say you want to create Amazon.com like e-commerce website for a particular company. So, what you need to do is that you not only have to create the site, but you also have to provide an administrator panel so that the admin of that website, who is a non technical user, should be able to add new products to the site. He needs to add new categories to the site. He could do a bunch of things by the admin panel. And in other cases, while you are using other frameworks, you have to create this admin panel on your own. But in case of Django, Django actually provides you with a very awesome functionality, which is they automatically provide an admin panel for each site which you create. So what this admin.py file is used is that if you have to add a particular model in your admin.py file, this is why this particular file is used. And what are models? We are going to learn that while we discuss about the models.py file. This apps.py file is nothing but it helps with the configuration of the app which we are currently using. So the current application is photo app, and this file contains the configuration of this particular application right here. Now let's move on to the models.py file, which is one of the most important files in Django. So what this models.py file does is that it holds up the structure of your database tables. So if you're already familiar a little bit with the backend development, then in the backend we have database, and the database is nothing but database is a place where we store all our data. And if you already know, the database data is actually stored in a form of tables. So let's say if you want to store information of a student, then in the backend we have table student, and that student table is actually going to hold the data of students in a tabular format. So what this models.py file does is that it allows us to create models, which is nothing but the table structures, so that these models can later be converted into tables, and then eventually data can actually be stored into those tables. So that's what models.py file is. It is simply a file which allows us to define the structure of the database tables. Then comes the test.py file, and it actually helps us to basically go ahead and develop some test cases to in order to test out our application. So that's the purpose of this file. Now comes the views.py file. So if you don't already know, Django is a model view controller framework. So what model view controller framework means is that it has three parts. First one is the model, which is nothing but the database structure here. Then we have views. Views is nothing but it actually is a visual representation of those models which you have. So views.py is going to help us to decide how we want to actually show users the actual model which we have. So what views.py file actually does is that it allows us to define a way in which the data has to be displayed to the user. So this views.py file actually helps us in representing the data to the user. So that was actually a basic overview of these files inside an application folder. So in the next lecture, what we will do is that we will start writing some code into these files. So the first file which we will be working with is going to be the views.py file. So we will write a particular view, and when we actually go ahead and use these files, you will understand them in a much more better way as opposed to what you have understood now. So that's it for this lecture, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Thank you.